I could probably do a whole Historians of the Movies podcast devoted just to World War II films. And for good reason. It seems like film and filmmaking developed alongside the memory of World War II coming out of 1945. Things just went forward. And we got a slew of movies. Actually, movies being made during. I remember I took a course at Wichita State University, World War II in film, and I thought I was going to come in and watch Saving Private Ryan, I was going to Big Red One, or something like that. We ended up watching all these movies made during the war itself. I was shocked. Half the films were in black and white. I remember some of my classmates were complaining about this, and I loved it. If you've not seen The Best Years of Our Lives, with Teresa Wright as maybe the most beautiful human being I've ever seen in my life, you are missing out. We talked all about these movies. There's a whole bunch of World War II films that are being made, and really we saw this resurgence, right, beginning in, say, 98 with Saving Private Ryan, and then that spawned, obviously, the whole bunch of films like Band of Brothers, and Pacific, the miniseries, and others, a new series. We're going to get into this today, talking about the one coming from Apple TV, the third, if you will, in that kind of trilogy about Air Force pilots, the bombs, and so forth, right? But there's no shortage, is what I'm trying to say, of World War II films. So it shouldn't surprise you that on occasion we're going to jump into these, although I can't recall if we've done a World War II film here on the podcast or not. We still haven't done this film actually on Sunday nights, which is Fury, the 2014 film starring Brad Pitt and John Bernthal. It is a gorgeous film. And really, it's weird. We talk about World War II films. There's a bunch of movies about soldiers, infantry. There's a whole class of submarine films out there. But tanks, for some reason, don't get that love. In a lot of ways, tanks, if we get into this, tanks are a lot like submarines, right? You're in enclosed spaces. You think that you're this alpha wolf on the battlefield, but everybody's trying to get you. And the Sherman tank, as we'll talk about with our guest today, is not this super fortress. It is in some ways a prison for the young men who were fighting inside of it, trying to stay alive. So all of that's a long way of saying that our guest today is Dr. Waitman Beorn. He knows a hell of a lot about tanks because he used to live in one himself. He's a American military veteran. He served in the United States Army, was a tank commander, and now is senior lecturer, which is essentially the British way of saying professor of history at Northumbria University in Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK. I'm told, as an Americanist, that the UK is somewhere across the ocean, but I don't know that I believe him. Dr. Beorn was also previously the director of the Virginia Holocaust Museum in Richmond, Virginia, and the inaugural Blumkin Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. All of this is saying is that not only do we have a guy who has actually lived in a tank can tell us and does tell us firsthand what life inside of a tank is like, we also have an amazing professor of World War II, of the genocide that happened, of the Holocaust that happened during that war. And we don't really talk as much about the Holocaust during this pod today, but we have this amazing talk about what this movie does right, what it does wrong, and kind of where World War II films fit into all of this. Wait is a great friend of mine. I've known him for a long time on Twitter, and I think you're going to dig this pod. I hope you'll like it because it's coming next. Fury on Historians of the Movies podcast. Waitman Beorn, what's going on, dude?
Hi, how you doing? Good to be here.
Are you here? You feel far away. You feel like across an ocean of time, but also an ocean of ocean.
I am. I'm in Newcastle, in England. I'm kind of a weird unicorn because I was tenure track and I gave up a tenure track job and then I managed to get another tenure track job
in England,
but it happened to be in England. So yeah.
How long have you been in England now?
I got here in 2019. Right before the pandemic hit and everything went to complete shit. And
yeah, y'all were like anti-Florida. You were like actually in lockdown.
Brand new country.
Oh my gosh, how do you make friends?
And then everything just went crazy. Yeah, it was nuts. But England, compared to lots of places in the U.S., at least took things seriously and somewhat seriously. And so, yeah, so I ended up in England. I'm very happy here.
I do have a question for you if we jump in this movie. How is the food over there?
It's fine. It's fine.
Is
I
it?
mean, look,
Is it better than Kansas? Because I see pictures with beans.
the only thing, well, okay, so breakfast needs work. The biscuits and gravy thing is not hit here yet.
I fantasize about like starting a Southern barbecue restaurant in England and be like, let's go. I know they've got pigs.
Yeah, well, yes, they do. I just learned how to make white gravy with white black pepper gravy, and that's changed the world for me. So breakfast not so great. Like the English breakfast is kind of like I feel like I can't tell if people eat it like ironically, because it's like I mean it's like black pudding, which is fine, tastes good, but looks horrible. Like 2 sausages, ham, what United States would call ham, and like a fried egg. And it's great, but it's no like Denny's garbage plate kind of thing, which is like really. But the only thing, to be honest, the only thing that I would really say negative about England is like their Mexican food is absolute garbage. Like literally Taco Bell is the best Mexican you can get in the UK. And I know exactly what I'm saying when I'm saying that, because I know Taco Bell is not. But I mean, like when I was in the Army, I was in Texas for 5 years. North Carolina, obviously, like most places in the United States have great Mexican food because we have great Mexicans that are making it, or people from that, who have, connections.
The Mexican diaspora into the United States has resulted in a lot of great things, great people, and so forth. One of the great things is like you can go to any town in the United States and get great Mexican food.
Yeah, and it's always
that's the one.
It's always that little shop in a strip mall with like the Coca-Cola sign, and then the name of it. Like it's not, but they make the best food. And I think the problem is literally that there just aren't a lot of Mexican people in the UK, because the Mexican food you get here is just, it's bad, and the barbecue is not great. It tastes good, but it's not authentic. It's like it is actually barbecued meat, but thereafter the distinctions is sort of gone. It's not the same thing. So one of the things that I did is I bought a smoker. And so I literally make my own, like in the backyard.
I remember we had this conversation when you bought said smoker. You were like, I'm changing the game.
Yeah, it's good. So, I mean, but the food is fine. I mean, it's a stereotype, right? That, British food is terrible. It's not. There's some really, really good dishes. And then obviously, depending on what you're into, I mean, Indian food, you can get amazing Indian food because there's a huge Indian diaspora. And,
so what you're saying is colonialism in your mind is a good thing, and you support the British Empire.
Jeez. Oh no!
We just want to go ahead and get that on the record now, so we can quote that and put that in the promo. Wait, colonialism.
I would get no. It's a positive unintended side effect, we'll say.
All right, fair enough. So, what are you doing now? Like what job? What are you teaching? You said you got a tenure track gig over here in the old country. I'm going to call.
Yeah.
Where are you at, and what do you teach?
So I'm at Northumbria University, which is in Newcastle, and my scholarly area of expertise is the Holocaust. But as we talked about, maybe leading off with a Holocaust movie on the podcast might have been a little too grim for everybody.
I don't know how I'm going to throw one-liners out on that. It's like,
I mean,
even I know.
The only way that off the top of my head would have been if we did like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which is like just the worst thing to ever hit film about the Holocaust ever. It's terrible. It's like this weird. It's based off this guy who wrote a book for apparently like a young adult book, and he wrote it in like 2 weeks, and it shows. And basically, it's this kid, and he's the son of the freaking camp commandant, and he makes friends with a Jewish kid in this concentration camp, as one never does. And they're playing, and for this little Nazi kid, it's the boy in the striped pajamas because the guy's wearing a striped. And then at the end of the movie, basically what happens is the commandant's son sneaks into the camp to play with his friend, and they end up in the gas chambers and they die. Which is just everything there's everything that's wrong about it. It's like meant to engender sympathy or something for this kid, for the Nazi family. Anyway, so no, I don't do that. But what I do
for not choosing that film.
Yeah, no, I mean it's horrible. And the problem is it's the book is taught in like so many schools. It's kind of like a a go-to book, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
But anyway, no, I work on the Holocaust. I teach about the Holocaust. I teach about the history of anti-Semitism, going from sort of literally the Romans to present. I teach, modern European history at times, and some graduate classes as well. So that's what I work on is sort of in my scholarly world.
But we're not doing a Holocaust film today. Holocaust
not directly
going on, not directly, right? This is
not directly,
right. So you actually reached out to me, and say before we jumped on, you were like, "Hey, I want to come on the pod." Like you were the very first person who was like, "I want to come on the pod," and I was like, "All right, fine, let's do it." I was like, and you were like, "I want to do Fury," and I thought, "Hell yes, absolutely." Why? Why
yes.
Fury? Before we get into this real fast, I need to get your quick take on this. Coke or Pepsi? What you got?
Oh, absolutely Coke all day long.
All right, continue on. We can continue the pod.
And real Coke, because one of the funny things they do over here is there's a sugar surcharge. So like they all want to give you the Coke Zero, which I think tastes like complete crap.
It's not the same.
I need the regular Coke, so I always have to pay like 20 pence extra for the regular Coke.
I don't know what a pence is, but okay.
It's like a cent. It's like there's like a surcharge, like 50-cent surcharge if you want to have the real Coke.
Got to.
But I pay it every time. But yeah, Pepsi to me there's something, it's just too sweet. Like Coke
it's too sweet and doesn't have enough carbonation.
There's a crispness to Coke. Yeah, there's a crispness to Coke that's just like, yeah.
All right, back to tank fighting. All right.
Yeah.
All right, that's enough. People are like, for fuck's sake, will you let go with the soda thing? No, listeners, I won't. It's never going to end. Eventually, we're going to switch into barbecue styles. And then Thomas Lecoq from the 13th Warrior podcast will suffer because his barbecue choices are awful. Kansas City.
Well, I mean, I can go ahead and put myself on record. I'm a Carolina barbecue.
As am I.
I'm a vinegar. Georgia,
yeah,
I'm a vinegar base.
Let's go.
Vinegar base.
Vinegar base. North Georgia, like Memphis, absolutely.
With some cayenne pepper in it to make it spicy.
Just keep your mayonnaise away from me, man, because in Carolina they put that coleslaw in the pulled pork, and that'll get me fighting. All right, so how long are we talking? 15 minutes, 38 seconds. Why Fury? Like you were immediately like, not only like did I ask you what you want to do, you came to you're like, I want to do Fury.
Well, okay, so the other element of my sort of academic unicornness, right, is that before I was a nerdy historian, I was in the U.S. Army and I was in a cavalry unit. So I was a tank platoon leader for a year and a half, and then I was a scout platoon leader for a year and a half in Iraq. So I I like tanks. I mean, like, what can I say? I've done this stuff a little bit. Obviously not in the context of World War II or that kind of thing, but I think that's one of the reasons this movie strikes me so deeply is because I think it's really good in a lot of ways because it at least jibes with my experience. I like it from that perspective. And I have a vanity project that a book that I'm writing very, very slowly because I'm working on actual other books, but I want to write a book. I'm writing a book about World War II tank crews called The Crew. And the conceit of the book is each chapter is a position. So it's a chapter driver, a chapter gunner, a chapter tank commander, looking at like what is life like at each one of those sort of positions or through those perspectives. So I've been doing like a sort of a very low speed level of research, reading some memoirs and things like this about World War II, predominantly British and American tank crews, just to begin to think about this project. So Fury, I think makes sense. It's just a good film too, though.
So the thing that I love about this film is that it's the duality of it, right? Because ostensibly it's a tank movie, right? It's tanks, Fury, Sherman tanks, probably the most famous tank in American history. And you think, okay, big tank explosions, battles, things like that. But it's actually a really cerebral film, right? You've got all of these thoughts on the idea of the tank as home. The relationships between the men is really what the driving force, if you will, of this film is. And ultimately, also, this film is placed in time towards the end of the war, which we don't tend to see a lot of when we see World War II films. Usually we're looking at the invasion of wherever. And that's kind of this tragic notion, this idea that you hear Pitt talk about. It's like, this war is going to end and it's going to end soon, but a lot more people have to die.
Yes.
I guess maybe let's talk about your first impressions about this film as far as the tanks themselves. Were tanks a big deal like in Europe this point on, we hear a lot about the tank warfare in Northern Africa. What's going on with these Shermans during World War II?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing is like I'm not going to be too much of a rivet counter, which is like the oh well, it wasn't accurate that they had this thing and were doing
No one
that
gives a
thing.
shit about that. That's not what this does.
I mean,
yeah.
There are a few key points in the movie where I will do that and be like, this was bullshit and total bullshit, but I'm not gonna, do that the entire movie.
Counting rivets with Dr. Beorn.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the sort of the joke is in the modeling community, right? It's like, oh, your model of a Sherman sucks because you didn't have a rope over here or whatever. The kind of like thanks for the well actually guys, basically. So I mean, I think what's interesting about the movie, like to start with, is the Sherman is like to put it in context, right? The big showdown, the big tank showdown in the movie is with a tiger, right?
Mm-hmm. Terrifying tiger in this film.
A terrifying tiger, right? But there was only 1,300 tigers in the entire war, and there were 49,000 Shermans. Like, you get a sense of American industrial might. Like, we built 49,000 of these things. There were Russians driving them. There were British people driving them.
They were everywhere.
They were all over the place, right? And the Sherman gets a lot of crap because it's not a tiger. It's not this sort of like doomed death machine. Well, it is, but usually for the crew.
There's 49,000 of them.
But it's a functional modern vehicle, right? It works. It's easy to maintain.
Mm-hmm.
It's interchangeable. The parts are interchangeable. It's durable. It works. It does the job, right? Whereas a tiger, these are like almost like a bespoke sort of like artisanal tanks. I mean, like they're amazing when they work, but their tolerances are sort of so low that they break very easily. So it's kind of like the AK-47 of the Sherman is kind of the AK-47 of tanks. I mean, it works. It's functional. It's not super sexy and that kind of thing. But then you realize that in the war itself, most of the engagements are not these tank duels. They're not tank on tank. Like the tank on tank is like a thing that World War II buffs and people after the fact like to sit there and say, well, who's better, a Sherman or a Tiger? Or is it a Panther better than a T-34? And it's like you can have these conversations, but they're all kind of theoretical in a lot of ways. Because okay, well, if I say the Sherman, do I get to have the P-47 Thunderbolts along with it? I mean, do I get the rest of the U.S. Army behind that Sherman?
Air cover, right?
Yeah, do I get the air cover? Do I get the 5 other Shermans in the platoon?
Yeah, that's one of the questions. Like, how many Shermans do I get? Because you're not taking on a single Sherman. The whole idea of Shermans is like, and you see this in that battle. Really kind of that climactic battle, or not climactic, but midpoint battle with that tiger, which is like the idea of a Sherman versus a tiger. That's never supposed to be the case, right? You're taking on several Shermans. Right.
And they used to, I mean, like what the British did was they would actually, when the what's called the jumbo comes in, which is a Sherman with a 76 millimeter, so a big gun, right? There would be like, I think if I remember correctly, there's like one of those in every platoon. And so like you have like a certain number of like regular Shermans, and then you have like the big one. And so the idea was like occupy the tank while the jumbo can get in, the Sherman Fireflies, what they called it, can get in and get a real good shot in, right? And so that scene is absurd in the movie because the tanks are literally like 8 feet apart, which is bullshit. Like, I mean, you wouldn't do that. The battle drill is spread out and keep the tiger occupied and flank it, and then shoot it in the ass and it dies, right? And a lot of people give the movie shit because of that. They're like, oh gosh, this is the filmmaker's dilemma. How do you film a flanking maneuver over 2 kilometers? It doesn't work, right? As well as doing this sort of weird online, we're going to bum rush them tactic, which finally towards the end, you sort of see they begin to split off a little bit.
Right.
But the tiger, kills them. And that's one of the things that is kind of garbage about the film. But here's my overall summary of the film. It's a vibe. And the vibe is 100% correct. The vibe of like being in a tank, fighting in a tank, living in a tank, mounted warfare, like the environment, the vibe, the feeling of the movie is 100% accurate. If the rest of it often isn't, in the sense of like historically would we have been doing this or would we have done that? But like the feeling that you get from that film is the best depiction I've ever seen of like what that feeling is like.
Okay, can you talk to us a little bit about that then? Because you've got, for unlike a lot of our historians who were actually never knights in England or
Yeah.
Vikings or anything like that, or not yet at least, you've actually sat inside and like been in a tank crew, and I'm assuming
Yeah.
it's the Abrams you were part of, the M1A1. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
M1A2, but yeah.
What's that like? Is that different from, say, the life of soldiers that we might see, infantry soldiers we see on the ground, or bomber crews, or things like that? A lot of the reading that we see on this film, and I saw a lot of people when I posted the other night that was watching this film, people were like, oh, wow, they really get that vibe. Right. What is that? What's going on with this? We've got 4 or 5 guys inside this thing.
Yeah, so the Sherman had 5 guys in it. So the Sherman had a driver, a bow gunner or radio operator, which is Norman in the film,
Mhm.
and then it has a gunner, which is Shia LaBeouf's character, and then a loader, which is the guy who I only remember him from Walking Dead. I
Bernthal.
forget his name. Yeah, I go. He's the loader, and then of course,
Kunas, they call him, I think. Right.
yeah, and then a tank commander, right? So it's 5. An M1 that I was in has a crew of 4. We don't have a bow gunner. We have a driver, a loader, a gunner, and a tank commander. But it is, I mean, there's so many things with that movie that resonate with me. You know, the idea of the tank as your home is just 100%. You know, like even so, for example, as a lieutenant, right, as the platoon leader, if your tank gets hit or if it gets has a maintenance problem, you have to do what's called jump tanks. And I basically take somebody else's tank and I hand my broken tank to like my wingman and say fix the thing,
Oh.
and I carry on with the fight, right? Because the leader is supposed to stay there, right? So you jump tanks, and I've done that lots of times in training, you know, that kind of thing, because like your tank will break and the mission continues, and so you sort of say, hey, you need to babysit my tank, and I take your crew, and we continue on. And it's like being in someone else's house. It's completely different, you know, the way things are, you know, like this small group dynamic of 4 guys, 4 people now, because we have women in tanks, which is totally cool. But you know, 4 people in a crew, you just get to know those people really, really well. And I think that's one of the things that comes through so powerfully in the film. You know, even when they're like when they have the joke about, you know, that they think Hitler would fuck them for a candy bar, and you can tell they've had that joke before. It's like a recurring, it's like
Mhm.
a recurring joke. That was, you know, that's what it is, right? And the fact that, you know, people have in the crew, they have different foibles and different eccentricities, you know, and things that, you know, like my gunner in my first tank was just an absolute neat freak, and he was like, the tank must be clean, which is totally cool. But you know, I remember when we took the tank out for the first time because we got brand new tanks, which is kind of cool. And we were driving literally through the woods, like through trees, and I was just the turret was just completely covered in like pine needles and like branches and stuff, and my gunner just wanted to murder me because he was just like, look at this, look what you've done to my like beautiful tank, you know, that kind of thing. So I think the depictions of the interactions, even when they're not getting along so much, you get the sense that even when they're fighting with each other and they're angry with each other, in the end they still like each other pretty well. That's part of the vibe in the movie that is just 100% accurate.
I'm wondering, you know, the big portion of this film is driven by the introduction of this character, Norman, the new guy, a radio operator who's learning this. He's our entry into this world. He's the outside force, and this is a thing that I think that, you know, the Band of Brothers series explored really, really well, which was talking about, you know, these replacement soldiers and how you take a person who is completely outside and then jam them into this very tightly knit group. How do you feel about like that? Is that a thing that you encountered as well, or is that a mechanism that you're familiar with inside of the armed forces? Is like taking this new guy, this FNG,
Yeah.
and throwing him here into this group. How does that work? Do these guys not like him, or because Pitt says, "Hey, don't get close to anybody."
I mean, this is the stereotype, right? And you see it in Platoon, and you see it in like some other movies about like, you know, like stay away from the new guy because he doesn't know enough and he could get you killed by being an idiot.
Right.
And also there's also sort of the thinly veiled idea of not getting your feelings hurt. Like don't grow to love a guy who's gonna you know get killed until after a certain point. So like we're not talking about Platoon, but in that movie, There's a certain part where they say, like, what is it? Chris is dead. Like, this is so and so. He's been reborn or whatever, right? And that's
Right.
like the moment when he becomes like he's okay now. He's part of the group. Fury does that all right. I mean, it certainly happened that like random people who weren't trained for a job got stuck into it. It must be incredibly stressful to be the new guy dropped into a unit like that, even a tank like that, where like everybody is very, very clearly knows what their job is, and there's nowhere to hide. It's not like you're an infantry platoon of 30 guys and you can kind of get away with stuff. I mean, like everybody's right there. You can see if they're not doing the right thing.
Shia LaBeouf's character, Bible, is the hyper-religious guy in that group. How does religion play into all of this? Are soldiers by nature religious guys?
I mean, I don't want to generalize. I mean, like, and to be very clear, like, I was in a tank. I was a tank platoon leader for about 14 months, and then I was in a Bradley, which is kind of like a baby tank. So I have that experience, but I'm I'm not at all comfortable speaking for even everybody's experience in a tank. Certainly not World War II. The cliche is there are no atheists in the foxholes. The more interesting spiritual discussion is less about sort of the religiosity of soldiers, because that's kind of hard to generalize about, I think, because also you may or may not be outwardly demonstrative of your religious beliefs, right? And Shia LaBeouf is clearly like he's the analogies to the sniper in Saving Private Ryan, who like quotes the Bible and then like shoots stuff. But they're both like these good old boys from the South, etc. Right? I think in some ways the more interesting spiritual discussion is like, what do they believe in general? Like, what are you fighting for, kind of thing. And I think the film does a good job of this, because it's not really the sort of liberty, freedom, apple pie, go America. Like you don't get that, which is probably accurate, right? I mean, I feel like in the end, most people in war do brave things for the people around them, not because they love America. Like you may join up in December 8th, 1941 because you want to be patriotic and fight for America. But what's going to cause you to like charge that machine gun nest is probably not your sense of obligation to the founding fathers or something. It's just I want to stop them from killing my friends. There's a great book which I'll plug called The Warriors by J. Glenn Gray, and everybody should read it. And it's not a sort of a super boring academic-y book. It's the book is written by this guy J. Glenn Gray, who literally got his PhD in philosophy and the next day got his draft notice for World War II. And so he goes off to World War II with this philosophical sort of outlook, and he writes his book, which is basically his observations of war, but from a philosophical perspective. And so he talks about all these things like the delight in seeing, the delight in destruction, like the way people sort of engage with the violence that they're experiencing. And he says, some of these people are just there for the violence, but that's a really small percentage of the people that are there. Most are there because they have to be. And then if they're doing amazing things or brave things, it's probably because of the friends and people around them, that they're doing this for, not because they want a medal or they want some kind of recognition for it. So I think that's interesting when you look at the film and even in Fury, right? Like Brad Pitt's character, when he's talking to that company commander, and the company commander says something like, God, why won't these people just quit? And he's like, would you? And, I am the last person to try to humanize Nazis in the sense of like have sympathy for them. But it's absolutely correct. I mean, like if you're fighting for your country, because which they were at that point, regardless of all the horrible things that they're doing and have done, it's the same argument with the Confederacy, right? I mean, like you're going to keep fighting,
There's a duality here, right? You see this in the film itself towards the end of the film. And if you haven't seen this film, I want to pause this for a second because we're going to spoil the hell out of the rest of this film. When you get to that climactic battle, right? The way that Pitt rallies the troops after Fury has been disabled, kind of pounds on her, is like, this is home, right? You get this fact that they're fighting in Nazi Germany, on Nazi territory, but the end of the film becomes them defending their home, right? Does it not?
Yeah, but that's the part where it starts like it starts to lose me.
Oh, does it?
It starts to lose me. You know, like,
Oh God, I love the final scene though. That battle is just kick. Oh God, that is some fun.
Oh, that battle is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. It's just
all
the
I can
dumbest.
think is how beautifully shot. They're fighting against 50,000 people.
It's beautifully done in like a John Wick kind of way, but it's just absolutely fucking absurd. Like, it's just an absurd. It's absurd on every single level.
All right, Dr. Bird, are you about to count rivets?
No, I'm not going to count rivets. This is me telling you the sky is blue, and the movie saying it's green. Like, that's how dumb this last scene is.
It's awesome,
and I like the film, but okay, look. So they're supposed to take this crossroads, right, to stop this counterattack or whatever that's going to ruin everything. And on the way is when they have this amazing battle with the tiger, which takes out 3 out of the 4 remaining tanks. Right, so it's only them, right? So
don't watch this movie if you're looking to like root for somebody to survive.
Yeah, I mean, like, war is hell. But then, so they go to this crossroads, and that's where the bravery part makes sense, right? It's like, that's pretty brave to take one tank and be like, I can do this. I'm going to set up in a position where I can cover this crossroads and hold them off long enough. Like that's kind of the 300 at Thermopylae kind of thing. Okay, I'll go with you on that. On the way, they hit a mine, which blows off the track. And when I was watching the film, this is rivet counting, but this is like professional rivet counting. When I was watching the film of the night, I kept looking at the undercarriage, and I'm like, I think that's fixable. Like, I think they could take that road wheel off, and they could put their extra track links in, put the track back on. They could limp that thing out of there. They don't need to like, and then I thought, okay, maybe it just didn't have time because the Waffen SS are coming down the road. Anyway, so the Waffen SS are coming down the road, and they're marching and they're singing, which is kind of like, okay, a little bit over the top. And there's like a million of them. And Brad Pitt basically says, in the end, he does like a great reverse psychology. He's kind of like, you guys can go ahead. I'll just do this myself.
I'm good. I'm solid.
And they're all like, oh, fuck. Okay, fine. We'll stay.
I guess we'll go ahead and die. Right.
And they all stay and they all die to prevent this light infantry marching unit that was going to, unravel the entire Allied effort, apparently. I mean, it's just nuts. It's just absolutely nuts. The Germans were the bad guys, but they weren't like idiots. Like when they realize that there's a tank sitting there that cannot move and is shooting them, they're just going to go to ground. They're going to work their way behind it, and they're going to shoot it in the ass with a Panzerfaust, and it's going to be over.
Right.
Like that scene would last in reality like 10 minutes.
Just go around the tank.
It was a very silly way to end the film, I thought. It's great Hollywood. It's the tracers and everything firing around, and that's cool. But it kind of overshadows sort of the rest of the film in a lot of ways. Yeah. I think, because it's just kind of like, geez, we had to have this weird like Die Hard moment, and then what do we do at the end of it? A fucking SS guy is like, oh, I'll let you live. What? Like, come on, that guy would have dragged him out of there, and
was like going to end up being like the guy. Like it's Saving Private Ryan, right? The guy who like walks. Remember the German soldier? They let him go away, and then he comes back to kill Tom Hanks. I'm like, well, this is the American version. Then this, Norman's going to go off to kill a SS Panzer Division leader or something like that. I don't know, but like all of a sudden we've got this guy just kind of looks down and he's like, yeah.
I mean, just think about this for a second. Even in the logic of the film, right? The film. I know we're trashing it, but I love the rest of the film. We could talk about the rest of the film. But
yeah, we do genuinely enjoy this film. Like, yeah, I like this movie.
I like the movie a lot, but I hate this part of it. Because, okay, the whole movie up until this point has basically been an extended essay in comradeship and the love that soldiers have for each other when they're thrust together into this environment, right? So we just had this tank mow down like 70% of this unit of Germans. And then one of the survivors sees one of the guys who mowed down like 60% of his friends a minute ago, and he's like, nah, good job, man. Like, no, come on. Like, that just
what would have happened would have been like what Pitt said was going to happen, right? They will catch you, and they will hurt you, and then they will kill you in a horrible way.
Yes, exactly. But the film itself, I think, it's really good. You mentioned I mentioned the killing of prisoners. right? Because there's that scene where
there's a scene where Norman is forced to
Pitt pulls
Norman.
the trigger for Norman and shoots that dude.
Yeah,
and this is why we sort of talk about accuracy versus precision, right? For lack of a better word, like if you think about like if you're shooting at a target, accuracy means that you've hit the target, and precision just means that your shots are very close together. So you can be precise but not accurate, or accurate but not precise. That's one of those films where, like, yes, okay, frequently U.S. soldiers would not take SS prisoners. That's a thing that we know happened.
Is this specific to SS or just specific to Germans in general?
No, it's more specific to Waffen SS, though you see it mainly in the Battle of the Bulge context. After the Malmedy massacre, when the Waffen SS murders, a couple hundred Americans, like for the rest of that battle, if you're a Waffen SS and you get taken prisoner, you're done. You didn't get taken prisoner, which is absolutely a war crime and is not something that I am glorifying, because I think some of the films think it's okay when Americans commit war crimes because it's the bad guys that we're doing it against, but it's not. So on the one hand, yes, it makes sense they would shoot that guy. I mean, when I say makes sense, I mean in the logic of the time historically,
right, yeah.
Not that I'm condoning that. Though whether or not he would have tried to force somebody into doing it, I think the better example, and I hadn't really picked this up until I watched it again in preparation for this podcast. You remember when they're in the town? They go into town and they force the people to surrender. Brad Pitt asks the German civilian if that's the Nazi who ordered the civilians to be killed in the town. And he says, yeah, that's the guy. And Brad Pitt tells one of the infantry guys who's walking along, hey, shoot that guy. But that guy actually says, hey, Bob, or whatever, I got another one for you. And then that really sort of like Punisher, grim-looking dude with like the hood on kind of like walks up and then blows him away and keeps going. I think that's amazing. That's an amazing depiction, because you have a guy who that small unit, that infantry unit, knows like Bob is the guy who he will straight up shoot.
Bob will do it.
Bob will do it. And so Brad Pitt doesn't have a problem with him being executed. The guy he tells to shoot him doesn't have a problem executing him, but that guy doesn't do it himself either. He has the other guy do it because he knows that guy's going to do it. And so I think that's where that makes a lot more sense to me, as somebody who studies war crimes, that kind of stuff. And that makes more sense. You have a guy that you know is going to do it. You don't need to force Norman. It's not analogous, right? The movie's lesson that it's trying to say is Norman wasn't willing to do his job in the tank because he didn't want to kill people. So we're going to make him kill somebody, and now he's going to be like Rambo. And I think those two things don't quite meet up. Like I think the idea that he didn't want to pull the trigger in that scene when there's kids in the woods and he's like, oh, it's a kid, that makes sense. And he needed to be taught that you have to do that. And there's that great line that you quoted the other night on Twitter, right? Of like, what, wait till you see what men can do to each other. I think that was a good example.
Single best line in that film.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's, on the one hand, if we're looking sort of long term, right, like a long trajectory of American filmmaking about World War II, it's great that they're showing Americans committing essentially war crimes because it happened. We were at the macro level, certainly the absolute knights in shining armor and the white hats and the good guys. And generally speaking, throughout the war, we didn't commit war crimes, but we did sometimes. And so I think it's good to show that. I feel like it might have been a little overdone.
Isn't that like a bit of a thought piece on like what war itself will do? I mean, and just, Bible's character says that, right? It's like, wait till you see what men can do to each other. It's like, not naturally, but like what war will make them. And you said this, right? The idea is like so much of this war crime is inspired by other war crimes. This idea of retribution that's been done onto their, so forth, right? It's like war itself almost corrupts the soul. Is that what it's trying to say? I mean, we've seen this in other films.
There's sort of probably two veins you can go with this. One is it sort of corrupts you in the sense of you sort of break bad, right? You sort of you become the guy in the town who's like Bob, and it's like, hey, Bob, kill that guy. And he's like, sweet, I'll do this. I like doing this. Or you get sort of a numbness to sort of humanity and human suffering. And so I think this would be a nice place to talk about that scene in the German town with like the girls and the dinner table and all of that. But even before that, right? essentially they go in this town and they're like leveling buildings. This is one of those situations where, it's the end of the war. Like nobody wants to be the last guy that dies at the end of World War II. And so there are lots of examples of this of, you come up to a town, it offers some resistance, and you're like, well, we could sort of go in there and fight house to house, or we could just level it with artillery and not risk anybody getting killed, and so that's a sort of a numbness factor, right? Of like, we're just gonna, I want to survive. But then you have sort of this weird scene with the women, the German women, which every time I watch it, it makes me a little more like uncomfortable on a lot of different levels.
Are you talking about the sex?
Well, yeah. I mean, like, this is a case, I think, of the filmmaker trying to cram too many truisms into one film, in the sense that, yeah, sure, like in the immediate end of the war and the occupation, it was possible to gain female companionship, relatively easily, we'll say, right? But I have a hard time believing that the Americans roll into a town, blast half of it, and immediately afterwards there's a woman basically being a prostitute. I find that really like unlikely. I mean, like, not to mention the fact that like I would imagine a lot of that phenomenon takes place in larger cities, because like imagine you're in a small town and the town has just been liberated by the Americans and all of your townspeople and fellow friends and neighbors are hanging out. Are you going to like jump into a tank with like two Americans and like, no, I don't think so. I think it's a little much. I think it's a little prurient and sort of, again, it's sort of mixing metaphors, if you will. It's kind of like, that was a phenomenon in sort of the immediate occupation era, that you could befriend German women either in a clearly instrumental way or in a somewhat more instrumental way with gifts and chocolates and that kind of stuff. But like in the immediacy of like all the things that happen in like, I mean, imagine like what's happened to Norman in like an hour in that town. Like he's gunned down a bunch of people for the first time with his machine gun. It's done a good job. So he's killed people for the first time. He's presumably had sex for the first time. And then the person he's had sex with the first time is killed. I mean, like, good Lord, like, how much are we really trying to cram into this moment? It seems like a lot.
It does feel at times like they're trying to encapsulate the entirety of the war into Norman's experience.
Yeah. And in the timeline of the movie, it's like, what, a day? He's not. It's not that long,
something like that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a week. It's
been a few days, a couple days in that town.
It doesn't give you in the town. They're only in the town for like an hour, 2 hours. It's trying to do what I go back to Platoon but it tries to do what Platoon does for Chris, which is show his arc over a long period of experience in combat. But it doesn't quite work because this guy's literally a week.
To me, the scene felt forced because, again, you've got folks just running into Nazi Germany, and then things turn sexual super, super fast. And I don't know enough about these conditions to say like what happened and so forth. This forced sexual encounters. Is this a thing where you've got two young? It just felt off to me, and I don't know. Yeah. I don't think the movie suffers if you just take those scenes out. I don't think those scenes are necessary to the film.
I think that the sexual piece made me very uncomfortable. Number one, it kind of soft pedals rape, really, if we're thinking about it.
I think that's ultimately what we're talking about.
Like, ultimately, Brad Pitt is basically saying, you rape her or I will, which is kind of awful. And it kind of soft pedals that as if these two guys, this girl, this guy have this starstruck attraction, which I have a hard time. I have a really hard time believing. So it kind of soft pedals sexual violence, which is not cool. But even if we take that part out, and this is the part that I think works in an uncomfortable way, it's like, well, maybe works, maybe doesn't. I don't know. Like the way they try to ruin his like staged domestic bliss moment, like Brad Pitt he just wants to have like his eggs sitting at a table with a tablecloth, and these guys come in and they're dirty and they're drunk and they're wearing crap they've looted from houses. I mean, I think that actually it's supposed to make you uncomfortable because these aren't sort of the longest day heroes. These like squeaky clean, like, Sean Connery hitting the beach at Normandy. These are like.
Can we talk about that in like American memory? Because we're kind of getting at this idea about American soldiers being capable of war crimes. Absolutely rape, absolutely murdering captured soldiers, all of these things. I remember growing up in the 80s, right? And so much of what I would watch were like these revenge fantasies for Vietnam, right? Missing in Action, Rambo
Yeah, yeah,
Part
yeah, yeah.
2, right? Because it was the Vietnamese who kept our boys in these horrible conditions. And they were solely able, it was only the Vietnamese. Of course, I'm like 7. I've never heard of My Lai, growing up in the 80s. But it feels like, and this is not like dog on the United States time and things like that, but it was like there has often been this perception inside at least to my experience, my own educational experience, that when we would talk about things like prisoner of war camps or war crimes, that those were othered. Those were American enemies who would perpetrate those things, not the flag waving American things. And, is that just the fact that we still wrestle with the idea of our own ability to be inhumane to other humans?
So as you were making this point, I was thinking back. If you look at sort of World War II film, a lot of it is Europe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even things like The Dirty Dozen and, Saving Private Ryan and it's European theater based. There are very few films, really. I mean, like there's Flags of Iwo Jima, which is amazing, or Let Us From Iwo Jima, rather. There's The Pacific, but in terms of like the big budget sort of takes, and really that's the theater, and maybe one of the arguments for why there are fewer, perhaps, or at least in the modern, from a modern filmmaking perspective, is that like the criminality of the behavior of American soldiers and Marines is, I would argue, exponentially more in the Pacific than it is in Europe, because the racism piece is much more apparent. Like Japanese people look different, and they suffer from all of the anti-Asian racism that existed in the United States before the war. Whereas Germans, with limited exceptions, which are situational exceptions, right? Of like Waffen SS, you guys suck because you killed us, so we're going to shoot you, but not from a racial perspective. And so I wonder if some of these films are struggling with the tension of, we want to show that the Greatest Generation wasn't blameless, but we also want to make a European theater film because we think that's what sells the most. And so in order to do that, we have to show some level of sort of at least a hand wave to the fact that Americans behave badly sometimes in the European theater. But we don't really want to touch on the places that we systematically behaved pretty badly in ways that were much more explicit. I mean, so I think there is, I mean, you saw Private Ryan does this a little bit, right? With the, like, we washed for dinner and then they shoot them. They shoot the people trying to surrender, and Band of Brothers sort of does this by talking about Spears and the fact that he may or may not have murdered 15 German soldiers or whatnot, right? But even then, even in that movie, it's kind of like a haha, like that's the dirty little secret about Spears, where it's like, if you actually did that, then holy shit, like that's pretty awful, right? Yeah, it's interesting, the idea of how we handle criminality. I mean, and obviously there's a new Band of Brothers coming out. It's not Band of Brothers, but it's essentially Band of Brothers, but it's about the 8th Air Force. You're familiar with this,
It's coming
right?
on Apple TV last time I heard, right?
Yeah, it's coming out. Yeah, I can't wait. I'm super excited. And I'd be curious to see how they handle what is arguably one of the more criminal things, which is like the area bombing, of
Fire
the war.
bombings and stuff like that, of like Dresden and such.
Fire bombings, like the move away from actually trying to target things to just targeting cities.
Burning everything to the ground.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to see sort of how they handle that particular aspect.
How do pilots and air crews internalize bombing runs that are not just, you're not just targeting a railroad or a munitions depot. You're just bombing indiscriminately over a city like Dresden that's been there thousands of years, and you're hitting civilians, right? You're hitting homes and residential areas and hospitals and schools.
You're knowingly doing that, right? I mean, even at the tactical level, where like they would have various waves that would come in, and one would drop an incendiary bomb, and then like essentially they would have a second wave come in when everybody had come out, the first responders, and were putting out the fires, and then they would drop high explosives. It was more than that, right? But I don't want to get into like the sort of was it or wasn't it with that, but it's interesting. I mean, one of the things to shift gears slightly that the film I think does really well, and it's probably understated for viewers, is it shows the end, what we call the end phase crimes of the Third Reich, because in the last months of the war, the Nazis are murdering lots of Germans as well.
Mm-hmm.
There'll be villages where the Americans are literally like the next village over, and so you start hanging out your white sheets up from your balcony to make sure the Americans don't level your town. And then some SS guy rolls in and drags you out of the house and shoots you for defeatism. The movie did a really good job, I think, of showing that, and then showing sort of the various ways in which Germans responded to the end of the war, or the impending end of the war. Right. So you have like that scene, which could have been taken right out of a photograph it's a famous photograph of like everybody who got drunk and killed themselves. That happened a lot. There's a whole book. I have it right here, actually. It's called Promise Me You'll Shoot Yourself. And you'll notice I'm about that far into it because I had to stop reading.
Jesus Christ.
Because it's literally like this wave of suicides that
I mean, I'm like, promise Germany. Me you'll take out the garbage.
Yeah. No, this is like...
Promise me you'll watch... I'm like, any number of things to promise, but like...
Yeah, I mean, it's just, these waves of suicide sweeping Germany, oftentimes in Eastern Germany because they're worried about the Russians coming. But I mean, it's a fantastic book by Florian Hura. I'm not trying to run it down, but I read a thing where a woman had jumped off a bridge with her toddler, intending to drown them both, and then her sort of survival instincts kicked in, and she swims to the surface, and the toddler drowns. And I'm like, you know what? I'm done here. Like, I'm done. I'm gonna do something else. I'm gonna go walk the dog or whatnot. But it gets back to that this sort of last paroxysm of violence in Germany at the end of the war, where you have like a few diehard fanatics trying to keep fighting, and you have increasingly frustrated Americans, right? Like this tank crew, who are like, fine, we'll just level the building, or like we'll shoot anything that moves because like I don't want to be killed by some 13-year-old kid 10 days before the war's over.
Nobody wants to be the last guy to die in the war.
No, and you see that in the film. And I mean, I think that's something else that the film does well, is try to capture that frustration with why is this still going on. I think that, and the other thing is, I think that the PTSD, it's understated, but they do a really good job of that.
War Daddy's clearly suffering.
Yeah, I mean,
how could you?
It's not? It's the leadership thing, right? Of like when they roll back in, and the former bow gunner they have to pull his body out, and half of his head is still in there, etc. He acts like everything's okay, and then he goes around behind a truck and like has the breakdown.
Well, he's got to keep his shit together in front of his guys.
Yeah, one of the things that I've picked up on, reading up on for this project, is PTSD is different for tankers than it is for other like infantry people.
Because the closeness?
Well, the stress, right? And this gets back to, I think, some of the things that are really positive about the way it portrays, because there really aren't, we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, like our favorite tank movies, but like there aren't a lot of movies that are like based around a tank crew in this way. But this one really highlights some of the differences. It's when you're in infantry, you can dig a hole in the ground and hide. You can hide behind a tree. You can hide behind a fence, even when there's bullets flying everywhere. When you're in a tank, you can't really hide. I mean, like it's often about, in most tank combat, it's who sees who first and who shoots first. And so in that way, it's more like being in a submarine or in a ship.
There's some very much like Das Boat kind of response here, right? Where it's like these guys, it's a very claustrophobic area. And, from the outside perspective, I've never served in the military of the highest respect. You tend to think tank, big, fortress, huge gun, impregnable. It's a tank. This film is terrifying because once they introduce the fact that they've got these anti-tank guns and you start seeing these incendiary guns and what they do to the soldiers who are inside these tanks, you're terrified for these guys. This doesn't feel like a fortress. This place feels like a prison.
This is one of the things that's important, to temper Waitman's commentary here, because like Waitman's commentary is, when I was a tank platoon leader, I was in the baddest motherfucker in the valley. Like I was in an M1. Like no one's gonna mess with me.
There's nothing that can touch that tank, right? I mean,
not really. if I had gone to war, like I say real war, I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but if I had gotten to do a Gulf War one rather than Iraq, and I was in an M1, I'd feel pretty good about myself. I am, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil because I am the baddest motherfucker in the valley, kind of thing, right? Because that is an amazing piece of equipment. But the Sherman, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, it's good, but it is in no way
It's
an
outclassed
M1.
in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's not impregnable by any stretch of the imagination. It's not, and so you don't have that confidence. And I think it's also like a submarine in this way. Over half the crew has a very limited perspective of what's actually going on. I mean, like the loader can't, when the loader is engaged in loading the main gun, servicing the main gun, he can't see anything. He's in the middle of the turret. The gunner can only see a very narrow viewport of the world based on what he's seeing through his sight. The driver can see through a very small viewport, and the bow gunner but like, you don't know. You're relying on one guy, the tank commander, to be able to look around and see that there's a tank over there. Holy crap. And so you may never see the round that gets you, particularly with those anti-tank guns, right? I mean, the anti-tank guns killed way more tanks than tanks did.
Well, they did this really well in this film, right? I think they really set up again, this movie about this tank, but these guys, they're in danger. And I feel like the film does a really good job of like heightening that tension. Like there's this idea that you've got to do a thing and you've got to do it right now. This constant, they run into these anti-tank guns. Obviously, that tiger scene, which may be my favorite scene in the entire film. They're scared. It is a scary moment watching a bunch of guys with a huge cannon strapped to their car.
Yeah, that scene, which all the rivet counters hate because it's not like accurate in a sort of military tactics kind of way.
It does everything it needs to do.
It does everything else amazingly well. And like as I said, I've never been to war in a tank, like real war. The closest I've been was, you go to the National Training Center and you have these massive like laser battles essentially. But even in that scenario, you have that a small sense of that kind of urgency and like, gunner, traverse right, right. Can you see, like, do you see the target? Like, shoot, all those kinds of things. You're screaming at your driver. My driver, Jamali Samuel, was my first driver. And he was the most gentle, kind-hearted young kid. And I cussed him out for days on end, when we're in the middle of like maneuvering. And then afterwards I would, he knew that I didn't really mean it, but like,
in the moment,
you're just screaming at the guy. You're like, right, God damn it, fucking right, go right, and same thing with the gunner. And so that sense of like what's going on in the turret. And one of the things that I think the film did amazingly well is it captured that it's not chaos. It seems like chaos, but everything is happening in the way that it's supposed to. So even the fire commands, even today, if I was like in my car and we saw two tanks, I could say, gunner Sabo, two tanks, stationary tank. Then the driver says, or the gunner says identified, loader says up, and I say fire, and the driver says on the way, right? I mean, like, but all those things have a certain role, right? So and they use this in the film, right? So Brad Pitt says, gunner AP tank, and that means gunner alert. Hey, gunner, I'm talking to you. AP is loader. I want you to load an armor-piercing round. And then, the gunner says, in my world, the gunner says identified, meaning, okay, you're telling me that you see what I'm telling you to see. And then the loader says up, meaning he is out of the way and you can fire the gun. And then the gunner says on the way so that we know that that you're going to shoot. But you get that frantic sort of, the gunner is waiting to hear that up, that clear, so he can shoot, because if he doesn't, that gun can come out and kill you. The other thing about tanks is that they're equally dangerous to the crews inside them if the crews inside them aren't paying attention. Like in the M1, and same thing with the Sherman. Like if my elbow was in the wrong position, the main gun could come back and break my arm in a minute. It's not hard. And so like that sense of desperation, but that frantic sort of nervous energy, I think was really well captured in the film, because it's literally it's a game of inches, to sort of paraphrase Al Pacino, right? I mean, but it's split seconds. Like who can get their gun on the other guy first? How fast can you reload the gun? Is your driver good? These things all matter. But in the end, if any of those people screw up, it could be one round in the tank.
You're done.
And everybody's dead.
Yeah.
And you die in particularly horrible ways.
Like there's no flesh wound for a tank crew. It's everyone. It's a horrible death for everybody. Like especially with those incendiary like anti-tank guns. It's horrible. There's no escaping it.
Yeah, I mean the Sherman had the nickname of the Zippo or they called it a Ronson liner, because it was like it would burn. It would burn a lot, based on a lot of things like the kind of fuel and where the fuel was stored and that kind of stuff. But it's amazing if you start reading some of these memoirs and writing about tanks and war, how many people like got out. Sometimes you had a period of time, but usually it's like the tank commander or the loader, someone who has access to a hatch. Because if you're the gunner, and you're down in the belly of the tank, you got to crawl past two people to get out, or you got to wait for them to get out.
And a destroyed tank, right? Like whatever the shell has done to the tank as well, right?
And if the thing is burning, if it's gone up, then
you're done.
It's awful. And I remember, one of the things we did in training was evacuate a casualty from the tank. And so like you would train, like, what do we do if the tank gets hit or like the gunner is wounded or somebody? And that's really hard. So you think about how do you wrangle a dead weight body out of past all the crap on the inside of the tank, out a turret, onto the back deck or whatnot. I mean, that's really difficult and not something you can do particularly quickly. And so like, people would die in really, really awful ways. What it really brought home to me and what I think it brings home to audiences is this: you're very exposed, and you're very exposed because tanks are big and they're loud and you can hear them coming.
And they're the primary threat, right? So they're going to draw.
And they draw a lot of attention because of what they're able to do. But you can't really see what's going on. You don't know what's going on. You're just sitting in for most of them, sitting inside the tank, rolling around, and you have very poor situational awareness of like what's happening outside, which I think in some ways can heighten the anxiety of the moment because you can imagine what's out there waiting for you. And I think one of the things that the movie does really well, it lays bare that idea that a tank is always this sort of undefeatable, impervious metal beast that can just exert its will on the battlefield, because they can't, even in the modern period. We've seen that with Ukraine, but like, it's dangerous to be in that thing. And, it was not invulnerable. It could get killed, and a lot of them did get killed with lots of different things. But conversely, you have this sort of fear of leaving it. You're comforted inside the vehicle because it's around you, that makes sense.
Well, I want to ask you, we talk about the accuracy of this film and like how well it's done and so forth. I want to like transition if we can to, we were talking about other films. What other movies do you like? Like for I want to hear your top 3 tank movies. We want some tank porn here in HATM. What are we watching here?
So here's the thing. The caveat up front is that with very, very few exceptions, of which this movie is one because it actually uses an actual Sherman M4E8, which is down the road from me at Bovington at the National British Tank Museum, which is an amazing place. I haven't gotten there yet, but it's amazing. And they have the only running tiger in the world as well, which I think was in this movie too.
Right, yeah.
But with the exception of this movie, perhaps, the vehicles are gotten wrong in most movies, like badly wrong, right? If you're looking for like, I want to see the most authentic, an actual tiger fighting a Sherman, then this is probably your only option. There's a movie called The Beast, which is about a tank crew in Afghanistan, Soviet tank crew in Afghanistan. Really good movie. It's got one of the Baldwin brothers in it.
Oh, so this is an American production of a Russian crew, Soviet crew.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It's called The Beast. It's a 1988.
Please tell me it's Stephen Baldwin, so I can imagine the world's worst Russian accent.
It is Stephen Baldwin.
Are you shitting me?
Yeah, it's Stephen Baldwin. It's Stephen Baldwin, but it's a good. I think it's a really good film. It's very underrated.
I'm just imagining him from Usual Suspects right now, which is like the only role I've ever seen him where I liked him. But that's also because he was just weird.
It's a really good movie. I highly recommend that one. Patton, I think, is still a really good film.
Yeah, Patton. Okay, yeah.
You can sort of see how few real sort of tank movies there are based
It's
on
a
how
shit
far
ton of
back I'm going.
submarine movies. There's not that many tank movies.
There's not a bunch. I mean, Patton is a good film. Well, it's a good film except that the tanks, the German tanks, are basically like U.S. tanks that are clearly U.S. tanks. They just like slapped an iron cross on the side of them.
Yeah.
It's like that's the thing that bothers me about if I get into any rivet counting. It's like how hard is it to just do like a fiberglass mock-up of the turret? I mean, because the Germans don't have rounded turrets, right? So if you're using an American surplus tank or whatever, a British surplus tank, it's going to look immediately different unless you do something around the side. Anyway, but Patton is a good movie, with the exception of the fact that Patton didn't sound at all like George C. Scott, which I think is one of the ironies of that whole film, is that Patton had kind of a whiny voice, a high pitched
Who also
voice.
had one? Theodore Roosevelt, kind of a very nasally kind of a voice.
Right.
And, it's like, I didn't know about that about Patton.
But now, you if you mention Patton, and all anybody hears is nobody ever won a war by dying for his country. I mean, like you hear the George C. Scott voice, which is funny. But I think the film is pretty good. I think it's ahead of its time in the way it depicted PTSD and his treatment of his soldiers. I think that's really good. I think it's a good film from that perspective. I'm trying to think of a third one because there's a terrible one called Battle of the Balls, which is not in the top three. Even if I can't think of a third one, it's not in it because it's just so bad. Because
I'm telling you, I gave you the third movie. It's right there waiting for you.
But I haven't seen it, so I can't say.
Can I plug it for you? Can this be?
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Tank porn.
Go ahead.
Tank. It's like 1985. So it's James Garner. You're looking this up now. It's James Garner is like a master chief. Forgive me for not knowing. But he is a veteran tank commander whose son, played by C. Thomas Howell, who was in every movie in the 1980s, gets in trouble with a local law dog in northern by God, Georgia, and then has to take his own Sherman tank he had somehow acquired throughout the years on a run to Tennessee from Georgia to where they could be promised fair hearings or extradition from there. And it's all about like the attempt on the part of Georgia to stop these corrupt local sheriffs to stop this Sherman tank. It is phenomenal. And there's so much stuff you can get in here and talk about this week. And you can talk about Sherman tanks. Talk about James fucking Garner, who was awesome. I loved that. I remember watching it when I was a kid. It was Murphy's Romance, which was amazing. Him and Sally Field. And then all these things about law and order and so forth. Like it's so good. You've got to watch Tank. It's amazing. It's how I came to know about the bottom hatch, which comes to play in Fury.
It does.
You see that in Tank. The bottom hatch becomes like the Deus Ex Machina, right? It's like it's right there.
I will say there's another one. I'm looking it up right now because I can't find the title of it. But it's actually really good. There's a weird genre out there of like very low budget World War II movies that are just terrible.
And that's what keeps the history buffs in our classes.
But I mean, so terrible that I don't even you don't even want to watch them. They're just like they're bad.
Are these like the versions of like Pacific Rim that come out on like the channels?
Yeah, exactly.
Atlantic Rim and things like
that.
Okay.
It's like they're almost
it's like Saving Private Brian.
Yeah, they're almost like reenactors, being filmed.
Right.
Anyway, our viewers, our listeners can probably figure it out. But the movie is about the T-34, which is arguably the best medium tank of the war in some ways. Soviet vehicle. But Russian the story, right? Yeah, but the story, it's about the first T-34 because there was a big engineering debate between these two tank manufacturers in Russia about which version is going to get the go-ahead from Stalin to be built as essentially the workhorse, the Sherman of the Red Army. And the guy, and this part of it's a true story. The designer of the tank was basically like, all right, I'm going to drive my tank, the T-34, from the factory to Moscow to prove how durable it is and the fact that it can survive, all this stuff. And there's a movie about it. I think it's even a Russian film, but it is so good And it's so true because that guy actually died of pneumonia, the engineer, because he had been putting in all this work on it. But eventually, Stalin did say, "We're going to build this tank," and it does. It is the backbone, particularly when they get the 85 millimeter cannon on it. It's the backbone of the Red Army, and it shocks the shit out of the Germans when they meet it for the first time.
I'm telling you, I have a movie based on this right now. It's called "The Tracks in the Turrets," right? And it's like in Soviet Russia, we have family. Family, it's all in T-34. We drive tank to Moscow. One of us gets sick, he die. We all go to Gulag. It still is very nice. So for it's Fast and Furious, Soviet Russia. With tanks, I'm in. Really, that was just an excuse for me to like bust out my Soviet accent, which someone will complain about.
Really good. It's really good, and so I think that's in there too. I mean, there's a whole thing too. One of the things that feeds Fury and that Fury fed is also the, we could talk about it or not because we've talked for a while, but I can talk forever. Is like the gaming community, right? So like these games, World of Tanks and War Thunder, which are both they're basically like first person shooters except you're tanks, and so you like you go out on the battlefield.
Are they any good?
Yeah, they're good. I like them. I like.
Not that you've played.
I like War. I used to play World of Tanks, but now I play War Thunder occasionally, and it's fun. And because it's one of those, it's also one of those like leveling, right? So you level, and you can improve your vehicle.
Yeah,
you
get the reward system, which keeps bringing back all the stuff like.
But the problem of it, and Fury partnered with World of Tank or with World of Tanks, so like you could buy Fury the vehicle in the game and drive it around. But one of the sort of, to put my like condescending historian hat on, it continually brings up this top trumps of tanks sort of thing. This idea that like if it's a T-34 versus a Tiger, who wins? And of course, I'm going to say, well, who's the better tank commander? Who can read the terrain better? Who can maneuver their tank in such a way that they can outflank? That kind of stuff. Because there's so many other aspects, but it breaks down very much to, in these games, it breaks down to like, this tank penetrates this armor.
Yeah, it's ultimately mathematics, right? It's a mathematical code saying X versus Y equals whatever.
Right.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Right. You get additions or subtractions for terrain or elevation or any number of things, right? Not the fact that you've got 50,000 other Shermans with you, like me and the boys.
Yes. It's fun to get on there, but it's also sad because there are so many people on there that are like little Nazi fanboys, that are driving around on Twitter. German. It's this weird phenomenon of these people that have like this amazing admiration for, if I'm being charitable, German equipment. Like, oh, the Tiger is just amazing. What an amazing tank that was. Like, I have a Tiger T-shirt and I like to wear it around town, but not because I like Nazis, but because I think it's a cool tank, And that's me being charitable, right? I've gotten to the point where even in video games, I don't play the Germans. I'm not gonna. Yeah. I'm not gonna be the. I'm not gonna be the Germans.
No, I get it.
I'm not gonna do it. And their screen names are all like Rommel 35, and like it's like, oh, Jesus Christ, like
I love the Desert Fox. No, it's not okay to like that. And you hear this trope a lot, and you see this discourse on Twitter quite often, which is, oh, this guy wasn't really a Nazi, or he's only a Nazi because he had to be, or he didn't like Hitler. Right, you see that around Rommel all the time. Oh, well, yeah. Rommel famously, the discourse around Rommel is like, okay, and you get that, and not dissimilarly with Robert E. Lee, right? Great general, only with Confederate because he had to be. Really was actually, turns out he was actually a horrible slave master. He was. First of all, there's no such thing as a good one. Secondly, he was particularly brutal. We know this.
Well, I mean, it's the thing. With Rommel, I mean, okay, so first of all, above and beyond anything else, you are fighting for the Nazis. Whether you are a Nazi party member, whether you personally are deeply opposed to the Nazis, which I don't think he was, but say you were, you're still in the end are ultimately in the service of a genocidal state, right?
Right, yeah, absolutely.
But even then, Rommel's Afrika Korps had an Einsatzgruppen headquarters attached to it. And the Einsatzgruppen were the mobile killing squads. And had they gotten to the major Jewish communities in North Africa, they would have been lining them up and shooting them the same way they were in the Soviet Union. And they would have been under Rommel's command. And of course, somebody at his level like knows what's going on. And then this bothers me almost as much is that in the end he even wasn't that great just as a general, because like he was shit at logistics, and everyone's like, oh well, he would have done a lot better in North Africa if he had had more fuel. It's like, well, part of being a good leader is knowing I don't have enough fuel. It doesn't work like that.
It's funny. I was talking to Jeff Melnick the other day, and his pod's about to drop like tomorrow, as you and I are recording. And we talk about like the idea of counterfactuals actually is this really effective teaching mechanism. But what they're doing there is this: if they would have no. Yeah, I almost kind of go back to like this. Are you familiar with like American football? Like Bill Parcells says, "You are your record." It's like, oh well, if they'd only done this, if they'd be better. No, you're 8-8. You're 6-10. Whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's like we know how he was. That's what it was. But ultimately, yeah, getting back to the point.
Well, this is the thing that bugs the shit out of me, and I get it a lot sometimes with like students, but also with World War II buffs and people who are like, oh well, what do you think? What do you think that the Nazis could have done? Or what do you think the German army could have done to win in Russia? Do you think they could have won? And I'm like, why are we doing this thought this thought experiment? Like, why are you envisioning why do you want to imagine a future in which the Nazis win in the first place? Right? I mean, like, because people always are, oh, well, Hitler could have won if he had done this or he had done that. And it's like, okay, but why are we even investing in this? And the counterfactuals become exponentially less valuable with every step further down the counterfactual line, because then
what's the real aim of this thought process, right?
We have 1,000 more things that happen. Like if this didn't happen, and there's a great military historian named Rob Citino. I think he's the chief historian at the World War II Museum in New Orleans. And I was at a conference and somebody asked him, like, what do you think would have happened if Hitler hadn't invaded the Soviet Union? And he's a great guy. And he was like, well, if Hitler hadn't invaded the Soviet Union, he wouldn't have been Hitler, because it was so fundamental that they're going to fight that war eventually that like that's not a helpful counterfactual, because like that's like saying, well, what if Robert Kennedy had been president instead of FDR? It's like, okay, yeah, that could have happened, I suppose, but then everything after that moment is going to be so fundamentally different than what happened that it's not worth. It's different than saying like, what would happen if FDR had lived for another year or something. I mean, like that you can start to play with a little bit and think about, okay, what might this do for us in terms of his history? But yeah, some of these things, and you just like, why are we doing this? Why are we asking these questions? Like, why do you want the Nazis to win?
Let me ask you a question then about history. And this is our big one here. Is Fury a history film?
Yeah. So this is where it all comes back to roost, right?
All coming back. This is where the tracks on the HATM tank circle around in their
this is like the rivet counting and that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I think I would say yes, with like an historical caution. As I said before, I think you guys were talking about this on, I think it was the 13th Warrior one. You're talking about how I think Thomas and JW said that actually A Knight's Tale is one of their favorite medieval history films, even though it's completely inaccurate,
ludicrous,
in terms of like a medieval history. And I don't put Fury in that regard, but I think there's an analogy there in that I think the stuff about what it's like to be in a tank crew, I use the word vibe because that's what the kids these days use, but I mean in a more serious sense of like the overall sort of ambiance and feeling and the inner crew dynamics, I think are incredibly accurate. And it's the most accurate portrayal that I've ever seen. It's kind of until something better comes along, the band of brothers for the armored world. If you're looking for what tank combat was like at a level higher than a crew, it's not telling a history in the sense that it's all false in the sense that it's not, this isn't an actual operation. This wasn't a thing that actually happened.
It's not a documentary, right?
And and some of the major muscle movements in the film are just batshit crazy, like the final scene, which just sort of it jumps the shark. But I think, again, like if you have a little bit of understanding of what's going on, I mean, I think it is a really good film. I mean, it is a history film. I mean, it is about, it falls into the category of sort of World War II history. Oh God, I forgot the best film.
What was that? It's Tank.
Kelly's Heroes.
Oh, okay.
How did I forget the best tank film? I mean, that is an amazing tank film. I mean, come on, like That's just you can't. Sorry, I didn't mean to hijack, but I would have gotten deported or canceled if I had not mentioned. I mean, Clint Eastwood, Telly Savalas, Donald Sutherland. I mean, how do you possibly top Kelly's Heroes? Oddball. That's an amazing film. But getting back to the question at hand, I think it is history. It's not what you want to write your research paper based off of. I guess I'll put it this way, and this is the best I can say, is that as someone that was in a tank, though not in World War II by any stretch, it was authentic to me as to sort of what it was like to be in a tank crew. And I was in an armored vehicle crew in a form of a war. It was not World War II, and it was not Desert Storm, and those things carry over into that environment. So I think it's authentic. It's an authentic portrayal, probably the most authentic portrayal of what it must have been like to be in a tank crew at that particular moment in time. It's not necessarily an authentic portrayal of all forms of armored combat, or I don't think that some of the ludicrousness in the way that those sequences were shot rules the film out, or is fatal to the film, or even potentially particularly noticeable to people who don't notice these things, with the exception of the end, which was empirically ridiculous,
amazing and wonderful, and the best thing I've ever seen on film. Brad Pitt heroically saving not only all of Europe, but his squad, his home, Fury, with a big ass gun before some sniping bastard took him out.
But with a what 80% death rate.
He's so very good, very good at this job.
Well, no, he killed 80% of his crew.
Oh, that part was bad. Yeah, I don't think. I mean, I'm not a military guy. I think 80% casualty rate is probably not the way, or mortality rate. It's not the rate. Not what you're going for, unless you're Ulysses Grant and you are taking it to the South because you're like, fuck it, it's on. Waitman Beorn, where can people find you online?
I'm at Waitman B on Twitter.
Have you gotten into Blue Sky yet?
I am in Blue Sky. I'm also Waitman B at Blue Sky. I try on Twitter to moderate myself between going after white supremacists and Nazis and idiots, and providing some kind of beneficial intellectual content as well. But
it's tough, man.
Yeah, it's
a tough world out there.
It's a hard place to be, but it's kind of like, as long as my people are there, I will also be there. I'll be there for you.
Oh, and I too shall be there for you. Ollie, are you the take commander of the Twitter? Like, these analogies don't go very fucking far. That's good.
I am one of many Shermans fighting the good fight against the Nazis.
We are the swarm o' Shermans.
That's right.
There you go. Good deal.
We may not be completely invincible, but there are a lot of us.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so much to our guest, Dr. Waitman Beorn, today for jumping in and talking to us about Fury and God knows everything else over the last couple hours. Thank you, of course, to our intrepid, our furious producer at this point in time for having to edit all of this podcast, Fletcher Powell. You can find him on Twitter at Fletcher_Powell. Thank you to our listeners. That would be you guys. Thank you for coming in and listening into this conversation as you have continued to do over the last little while. Can't tell you how much I appreciate your support on this for the last 6-8 months now that this podcast is going. If you want to find out more about Historians of the Movies, you can find us at historiansatthemovies.com. You can find us online. You can find me on Twitter at HerbertHistory. And you can find Historians of the Movies on Instagram as well, Historians of the Movies on Instagram. So thanks for coming in. Thanks for being part of all of this. We'll see you a little bit later. Ciao for now. Bye.